Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We're in week number 32 of our study of Revelation. We're in chapter 20. We're going to get to verse 7 today. Initially, when I drew up the plans for how to break down this study, like I mentioned last week, I was planning on doing this whole section at once, last half of 19 and all of 20. But in order to do specifically this section, verses 1 through 7, justice, I changed my plans, which, it's kind of my prerogative. I'm the guy making these. But I wanted to give this section the gravity that, I don't want to say that it deserves, but that it needs, because this is one of the most highly contested sections in all of the New Testament. There have been entire branches of Christianity, entire denominations that split from one another because of this section. And as sad as that is, that simply means when we talk about it, we need to give it. We need to make sure we do it justice. So we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna talk about it in depth. We're not gonna get very far. We're just gonna get to verse 7. But I think that in the end, it'll help you at least be able to make up your mind, and hopefully, it'll put you in a position where you can disagree with other people about this section, and it doesn't hinder your unity as brothers and sisters in Christ. That's the ultimate goal here. Just put ourselves back into the train of thought. We have to remember that we are in a letter being written to first century Christians who are suffering at the hand of government. And so ultimately the point of this entire book, all of Revelation, is encouragement, to encourage people who are suffering. It explains why they're suffering. It explains who's responsible for their suffering. It explains how God is going to make their suffering worth it, and how God is going to bring about justice and end the suffering. But the whole point is encouragement to these suffering Christians. And so we have to keep that in mind, and if that's not the point, well, you might have missed something. We're going to talk about that in a second. But we're in the section where those responsible for the suffering are being dealt with. We had the horror, which is human depravity, humans' perversion of God's good designs, our proclivity for manipulating and destroying each other, the us side of evil. That's dealt with, and she's personified in the whore of Babylon, the beast and the prophet, the empire puppet of Satan, of the devil, and those who are supporting that empire, supporting the mechanisms of this world, which are ultimately the puppet of the devil. They are dealt with already. So that just leaves the true mastermind behind it all. Maybe mastermind's giving too much credit, but the being who sparked the initial rebellion that led to all the others, the devil himself. He's personified as the dragon or the beast or the serpent, which there's so many references to the Old Testament and the world of the ancient Near East to those three names right there that we just don't have time to go through them all. So let me just read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 20, and I'll break them down for you. So, starting at verse 1, it says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven. In his hand he held the key to the abyss and a large chain. He grabbed hold of the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and the Satan. He tied him up for 1,000 years and threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, so that he wouldn't be able to deceive the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were complete. After that, he must be let out for a short time. Then I saw thrones with people sitting on them who were given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had their heads cut off because they had borne witness to Jesus and because of the word of God, and also those who had not worshipped the monster or its image and had not received the mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with the Messiah for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come back to life until the 1,000 years were complete. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them. They will be priests to God and the Messiah, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are complete, the Satan will be released from his prison." Now again, we have to keep the point in mind here, right? We're talking about the 1,000 years of Christ. Like there are people who've spent their entire careers as theologians, as people who are professional studiers of the knowledge of God, and like they've picked one and kind of stuck with it and made their entire careers doing that. This is a highly divisive subject that I would argue is absolutely not. It shouldn't be. It should be one of those things where it's like, what's your favorite color? Blue. What's your favorite color? Red. What's your favorite color? Pink. Cool. And we all move along. Like, that should be what this discussion is. This should not be something that has gotten the attention it's gotten over the last 2,000 years. But it has. It has. And that's how we're going to view it today. We're going to look at kind of the big dogs as far as each viewpoint goes and why they thought what they thought and try to go from there. But as we go through this, if you find yourself just getting hot-blooded about it, like, and you disagreeing with what I'm saying, or you are agreeing too much with what I'm saying, like, then you need to stop. You need to step away, because the point here is to encourage us, is to encourage people who are suffering for the name of Christ, who are out there trying to reach the world for him and will inevitably have difficulties because of that. It should be encouraging to you that God is not going to let the injustices, the suffering go undealt with. He's going to make all things right. We have to be intentional about that. And so nothing in our passage that we're reading today should cause division. Nothing. If you feel yourself being like very divisive and feeling way too strongly about one of these positions, you need to just stop and take a deep breath, calm down, go pray, go talk to God about it, and then come back and look at the other opinions, right? So in order to understand this, we have to start with the big question about kind of what happens when we die, right? Because the New Testament is pretty clear, and the Old Testament supports it as well, but it's more explicitly stated in the New Testament that when we die, we go to the holding tank. We don't go to heaven. We don't go straight to hell, because there's a judgment day. There's a day when all the dead are raised, and we're all judged before the throne. And between now and then, we go to the holding tank. The people who of God, Christians, go to what's called Abraham's bosom, or paradise. And those who are not go to what's called Gehenna, or Hades. And there's no going back and forth. Once you die, that's where you go. Okay, but that's it. That's our understanding of what happens when we die. You go to the holding tank, and then you're resurrected for a judgment day. And at judgment day, you're given your eternal body. Revelation 20 seems to cause problems for that, though. Like it. All right, so it seems to allude that there's more than one resurrection. And so one of the principles of good Bible reading and Bible study is the Bible doesn't contradict itself. It doesn't. I'm not saying that you should go into it just assuming everything you read, it will automatically line up perfectly, because if you do that, you'll make mistakes, because not everything lines up perfectly at first glance. You have to do more study to get there. But if something contradicts another part of accepted Scripture, you need to step back for a second and go, hold on. What's the case here? What's going on? Does this really contradict, or is there something more to this? This is one of those times where it looks like it's contradicting other places in Scripture. Because Revelation 20, basically, let me summarize it like this. It says first that Satan, the devil, the enemy, that spiritual being, that cherub guardian, that initial rebellious Elohim spirit of God, he is bound up. Like, he is responsible for all of this. Like, he's the first big rebellion. All the other Elohim that have rebelled since are kind of subservient to him. That's the picture we get in Scripture. And that's what Revelation, the story it's telling, is that this is the guy who started it all. He is bound up for 1,000 years. And then martyrs, and specifically headless martyrs, we'll talk about why John makes mention of them, are given thrones to rule with Jesus for 1,000 years. And then after the 1,000 years, everyone else is raised, and Satan is let loose after the 1,000 years is up. Okay, so we see here that potentially there are two resurrections. That's confusing. And so what is going on here? Well, the way I understand, the way this makes the most sense to me, is this is the third interruption of Revelation, right? We've seen two other interruptions, right? Between the sixth and seventh trumpet, or the sixth and seventh seal, we have the seals, things have been broken. That's where the four horsemen were, that the evil is being exposed. There's a pause so that the martyrs could be sealed, right? Those people who had suffered and died for the sake of Jesus, they're sealed up so that they are safe. They're safe until Judgment Day, okay? And then between the sixth and seventh trumpet, the prophets, that's where we get the story of the two prophets, and we see the story of those who have suffered for the name of Christ to share the message that God told them to share, the suffering of prophets. It's kind of John's bio as to what a prophet is and why he is a prophet and how he became a prophet. Both of those instances are about suffering and the martyrdom of Christians. It's like, exactly what we're seeing here too. And so I think this is just another interruption where John is giving a tangent. And again, if you read John's writings, whether it's the Gospel or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John or Revelation, you see he doesn't have a sequential order very often. The Gospel is probably the most sequential, where this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But even in it, he has a lot of his repetitions and jumping around. John likes to write cyclically, where he'll just jump in and point A to point B, then point A, B, and then he'll add C, and then point A, B, C, and then he'll add D, and he just keeps cycling and jumping around. The interruptions fit with his MO. And again, this is either John the Apostle or one of his direct disciples named John. Either way, this writer is following that MO. And so I think this is another interruption to kind of explain things again, to give another point of view of what we've been talking about. And so understanding this is going to be important. We're going to look at it from the 4 point of the big 4 prominent views of Revelation 20 throughout history. We're going to look at the view of St. Irenaeus. We're going to look at the view of St. Origen. We're going to look at the view of St. Augustine. And we're going to look at the view of Jonathan Edwards, who's never called a saint, but he's just as much a saint as the other 3. But basically, all 4 of these interpretations come under 3 categories, right? Premillennial. This means that the 1,000-year reign will come after Jesus returns. So Jesus shows up, and then he reigns with his martyrs for 1,000 years, okay? The second view is postmillennial. The kingdom is established by the martyrs through Jesus, obviously, but they reign for 1,000 years, and that 1,000-year reign ends when Jesus returns, okay? The third one is amillennial, and amillennial kind of is a bit broader in that it can be either you're anti-millennial or you think the millennium is allegorical, right? So it's not literal. It's not a literal 1,000 years. So you have the 2 literal 1,000-year views where it either starts with Jesus' return or it ends with Jesus' return, or you think it's something else where it's not a literal 1,000 years. Now the views that we look at here, none of them rely solely on Revelation 20. So again, that's kind of a foreshadowing of what's the point here, okay? But none of these views in their entirety, and these are ones that you've probably heard of before, and if you haven't, they're the most popular views out there. None of them rely solely on Revelation 20, okay? So we see in Irenaeus, he lived in the early 200s, so he lived roughly 100 or so years after the time of the apostles, and he spent a lot of his time fighting Gnostics. That's important to understand why he had his view, right? Gnostics viewed that there was secret knowledge out there, right? Gnosticism was a real plague in the thorn of Christianity because they would look at the Gospels and they would look at the writings of the apostles and they'd say, yeah, we agree with that, but here's what they really meant. Here's the secret information. So they would constantly twist everything and pervert it into something that's very much not in line with the Gospels, not in line with what the apostles thought, not in line with what we call Orthodox Christianity. Gnostics were heretics. They were not Christians. They claimed Christ, but they claimed that they knew some secret information. And so if you are constantly fighting against people who are taking things allegorically or taking things not literally, it's easy to understand why this guy might have a very literal understanding of it. He was a premillennial. He is the preeminent premillennial view. He expected that there would be a golden age of 1,000 years when Jesus returned. Right? It was very utopian, and he emphasized in his writings about this utopian 1,000-year kingdom about the importance of beauty and the importance of goodness and creating and being what God created us to be, to subjugate and improve and make this world around us better. Like he's filled with language. His view of this utopian thing, and I love it. But he, like I said, he views that there will be a literal Christ shows up, then the 1,000-year reign, and then Christ would come back. And again, he rejected any kind of allegorical interpretation. He expected it in his writings. He acknowledges that there will be people who disagree, but for somebody who spent his whole life fighting the Gnostic heresies, yeah, you can understand why you might be a little hesitant and just be like, yeah, it's not literal, okay? The next one is St. Origen, and St. Origen lived around the same time as St. Irenaeus, and he fought, it wasn't full-blown, he fought anti-Semitism, but it was anti-Semitism And it's weird because anti-Semite Christians from this time, what they would do, a lot of them, is they would take the old Jewish views of things and just apply them to Christianity. So they would substitute Christians for Israel in a lot of prophecies and worldviews. So Origen fought against that a lot, and so his sense makes sense why he thought the way he did too, because he was anti-millennial, right? So his view was that Satan was bound at the beginning of creation and was loosed when Jesus came to the earth, right? So when Jesus put on flesh, he was born of the Virgin Mary, that's when Satan was loosed. And he rejects the idea of any kind of a true 1,000-year earthly utopian kingdom. Why would he do that? Well, one of the views that the Jewish folks had was this coming golden age, and a dominant view, especially at Jesus' time, was that during this golden age, it wasn't that all the non-Jewish folks would be done away with. It was that Israel would be placed on top, and the rest of the world would essentially be its slave, right? So all the Romans, all the Greeks, everybody all over the world would be slaves of the Jewish people. That was a common viewpoint. That was what they expected the Messiah to do. Jesus didn't do that, but some early Christians adopted that. And so he was vehemently opposed to that. He spent his life fighting against this kind of thinking of substituting Christians for Israel. And because that's not at all what the apostles taught. That's not what Jesus taught. It's not anybody taught within the Bible. We became one, right? There's no us versus them. That's the point of Jesus, is there is no longer us versus them outside of the spiritual powers. It's us versus the spiritual powers, the princes of darkness, those fallen angels, fallen Elohim. But us against humanity, that doesn't, no. That's not it at all. There are people who will side with the other side, and that makes us kind of enemies. But even then, we need to be trying to reach them and show them, hey, here's the light, here's the truth. And so Origen was vehemently anti-millennial. He did not see any kind of literal 1,000-year utopia where God's people would be on top and everybody else would be slaves. Okay? Makes sense. Next is Augustine. And Augustine lived in the early 400s, so he lived several hundred years after Jesus. Augustine is arguably, you can make the argument that outside of the apostles, he's one of the most influential Christians in history, right? His works, City of God, have been instrumental in creating a lot of what we inherit today as Christians, especially the Middle Ages. They really were shaped by Augustine's thought. I personally have some big disagreements with Augustine's thought, but his view here was the dominant view for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, his view that we're about to talk about was the view of John Calvin and Martin Luther. All right, so this was the most widely accepted view for a long, long time. And his view was non-millennial. So he's not anti-millennial. There was no millennium. He was just that it's not a literal number. And so his view was that Satan was bound at the cross, right? So Satan was loose upon creation, and then at the cross, death was defeated, that has no more power, and Satan was bound up then. That means the first resurrection, if we're following this same train of thought, is your baptism. Every Christian is brought to life. We are made into a new creation at our baptism. Makes a lot of sense. And so, because there's this idea within Scripture, and this is really complicated stuff, that the already but not yet, that when Christ returns, his kingdom is completely fulfilled, right? There's nowhere that's not his kingdom. But between now and then, we are his kingdom, the already but not yet, okay? And so Augustine's view was that Satan was bound then in order to make room for Christ's church to grow and to flourish and to survive. It's not that there aren't other fallen Elohim out there, and it's not that he doesn't have any influence. As a matter of fact, Augustine's, the way he describes Satan's influence on the world is more that he's like a mob boss in jail, right? Like the mob boss is still running the show, right? But he's just behind bars. He doesn't have his freedom. So there's still influence, and his influence is out there in the world today, even though he himself is locked up. He's just not free to go about and destroy and accuse and corrupt the way he has been. Okay, that's Augustine's viewpoint. This was dominant until the Enlightenment, which brings us to our final viewpoint. This is Jonathan Edwards. If you are a big fan of John Piper, you probably have heard this guy's name a lot. Jonathan Edwards was doing his thing in New England during the 1700s, during the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was this period where basically the scientific method was born out of the Enlightenment. This idea that there is a natural law to the world and that we can document it and we can prove it. And if we ask the right questions and do the right tests, we can figure out and understand the world around us. So everything has to be documentable. Everything has to be provable. Everything has to be repeatable. It's done a lot of good things, the Enlightenment, but it also, when it comes to religion and philosophy, has done a lot of bad things because the scientific method and the Enlightenment way of thinking demands proof for everything. Jonathan Edwards was combating that in regards to defending Christianity. Therefore, he was part of the initial movement where Christianity became a prove it. We can prove it. You know, you've met people, you might be one of those people who you feel that there's evidence to prove your faith, that the Bible is you can put it under a microscope and you can prove it. I personally would disagree with that way of thinking. I don't think that's the right way to approach it at all, but that is the world Jonathan Edwards lived in. And so his approach was one where, hey, we have to be able to document things. We have to be able to prove things. Things have to make sense. They have to be logical. That's Jonathan Edwards' thing. Jonathan Edwards was a reformed evangelical. He was a devout Calvinist. Everything has to line up perfectly. It makes sense. That's the world he lived in. It was a reaction to the anti-Christian pressures that he was facing. And so Jonathan Edwards' view was that he was a post-millennial, that there would be a 1,000-year reign where Christ's martyrs at the first resurrection would happen, and they would reign for 1,000 years, and that 1,000-year reign would end with Christ's return, where he would usher in his new kingdom, which makes sense too, right? Like when Christ returns, that's when judgment happens, okay? So it makes sense that if you're having this literal understanding that you have 1,000 years where, you know, Christ's followers, his martyrs, they rule. And he describes it as this utopian thing, but to him, the way that this starts is at the defeat of the Antichrist's earthly kingdom. So he also had a very literal understanding that there would be an Antichrist who would establish a literal kingdom on the earth. And to him, if you read his writings, it was the Roman Catholic Church was the kingdom of the Antichrist. That was what he thought, okay? I disagree with that completely, but if you go back and you want to research this, well, you'll find that and you might be like, oh, that's what he was teaching me. No, like that. I'm reporting what I read. Okay. But that's what he thought. He thought the Roman Catholic Church was the Antichrist kingdom, and that when it is finally destroyed, that's when the utopian age of 1,000 years would begin, and it would end with Christ's return. Now, let me just kind of summarize my view then. Right, so these are the four big ones. I tend to line up more with Augustine, but let me just, I know this isn't flowing very well right now, but this is a very complicated thing. And again, my viewpoint is doesn't have to be your viewpoint, and that is A-okay. Unity, we have to remember unity here. But I tend to agree with Augustine. I like the idea that Satan was bound. It makes sense at the cross. Jesus talks about how he bound the strong man before he went into his house, right? It makes sense that would happen. The New Testament is full of language about how we're born again, that we're raised from the dead. I mean, that's the metaphor of baptism, is we're laid into the grave with Christ and we're brought up a new creation. It makes sense to me. It lines up a little bit better. And so Augustine's view is essentially that the church age is the 1,000-year reign. And it's not that it's a utopian kingdom, but it's that this is the age where Christ's kingdom on earth is established and Christ's people are being called and the kingdom grows and it expands, right? It makes sense to me. But on the other hand, I don't want to lose the beauty of Irenaeus and the beauty of that literal understanding that Christ's kingdom is here. Like sometimes we get too spiritual as Christians, that we think of our life, our destiny as spending in the post-judgment day. And so we lose the importance of beauty and art and growing and doing the things Christ has called us to do here and now. So I kind of have that hybrid aspect that I think the 1,000 years is really referring to the church age, but we are supposed to be doing things like making the world a better place and showing love and kindness and grace and mercy and doing the things that Jesus did. I kind of have that hybrid view. And And there are other things that make this make sense. That we see in Ephesians 2:6 that the church is ruling in the heavenly places. The martyrs are there. We saw that early in Revelation. The martyrs are the only ones who go straight to heaven. We see that they're reigning with him in Ephesians 2:6. The fact that there are multiple final battles in this sequence, that doesn't make sense to me. I think this is just an interruption. We've already seen the final battle. Here's another viewpoint of it. And again, the septenaries, those sets of 7 where God's justice is rolled out, evil is dealt with, they all kind of deal with that same idea, that evil is exposed and allowed to destroy itself. And if Satan is allowed to be let loose, well, what does the Satan mean? John is specific in using that word. The Satan is a job of an Elohim. It's a job of a spirit being, of one of God's divine assembly. And that job is to go about and to point out all the evil that humanity has done, right? We see this job in the book of Job. That's what the Satan, the Satan that shows up there is doing. They're going about to and fro on the earth to accuse the reprehensible stuff, to make sure that evil is pointed out and it is dealt with. The problem is the devil, he corrupts his position and accuses everybody and lies about everybody. He's the father of lies. So he corrupts his position, but still the position needs filled. And that's kind of God's MO, is he uses what evil intends for evil for his good. And so, again, I think that's kind of the point here, is that, yes, things are evil, things are broken, things are messed up, that there is an adversary, that there are adversaries out there trying to destroy. But in the end, ultimately, God's going to make things right, because our citizenship in heaven matters more. And that's what I kind of want to end with, is John makes mention specifically of beheaded martyrs. If you're familiar with the life of Paul, specifically the parts not in the Bible, he traditionally was executed in Rome, just a little right close to Peter, and he was executed with a sword by beheading. And that is safe to assume was in fact true. There's a really good chance that the tomb of the Apostle Paul is actually the guy. But the reason why I bring that up is a Roman citizen was the only person that had the right to be executed by beheading with a sword. Why is that? Because it's supposed to be the most humane way, right? That carried on through the Middle Ages. Like royalty, they were beheaded because if it was done right, it was a quick, clean death where supposedly there was no pain. And so if there are martyrs that are beheaded, well, that means these were Roman citizens. And Roman citizens had a lot of rights, they had a lot of protection, that they probably could have just quickly caved in a little bit and gotten out of it. But instead, they remained faithful. They viewed their true citizenship as citizens of heaven, as citizens of God's kingdom, where God rules, where Jesus rules, all the way to the point that they suffered death. And so by seeing them rule here, this is just another sign that should be very encouraging. The suffering was worth it. The death was worth it. We don't have anything to fear. Death has no power over us. That's the point here. So whether you think it's premillennial, postmillennial, literal, figurative, anti-millennial, it honestly doesn't matter. What matters is that we know that God is going to make all things right in the end. And that it's our job to stay faithful in the meantime, to share the gospel with people around us, to make this world a better place, a more beautiful, loving, kind place on earth as it is in heaven. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next week.